I'm mostly going to talk today about, sorry Lane, did you manage to turn that off? Perfect. I'm going to talk about social services and supports for people with disabilities. These are the kinds of queries that when people ask us about, we would often be directing them towards citizens information if they have like social welfare type queries, but it's good to familiarise yourself with the sort of basic disability allowances that are available to people if those are the kinds of questions that they have. So I'll try to talk a bit about that and some other issues that are connected to it, and look at kind of what's available from the state, what's kind of available at a local level here in Galway that people might have questions about, and then places people can go to complain if they're not happy with things. That's kind of the general scope of what we'll be exploring. So yeah, mostly I'm going to focus on disability-specific social welfare payments, and there are two different types of social welfare payments that people with disabilities can get. One is sort of a means-tested payment, so that's available to people, mostly people who are not in employment can avail of those payments, and then the other payments are based on the PRSI contributions, so those are payments really for people who are in employment or have been in employment and have then acquired disability payments that they can claim. Sorry, I'm just going to stop for a minute while people shuffle around. If I move up maybe one as well, then people can move up. Is that okay? Sorry, it's musical chairs. Is that everyone?
Yeah.
I want car keys up there. Two car keys. Pass those down. Just road matching with this 100. Okay.
We haven't run.
We've had. Okay, so you're all just in time because I'm just starting. Like I said, I'm going to cover two specific types of payments that people can get. One is the means tested, kind of the disability allowance, those sorts of payments, and then the others are benefits for people who have been in employment and have acquired a disability. I'll cover a little bit about the other supports apart from the main social welfare payments that you can get, like things like personal assistance. I don't know if you covered that a little bit last week with independent living. Yes or no? Not really. Nobody remembers. Okay. So I'll cover a little bit about that, and then I'll talk about appeals and complaints processes. So sometimes people will come to us and they're not sure if they qualify for something. Sometimes they're afraid to ask, afraid to go to the social welfare officer to figure it out, or sometimes they've been refused a payment and they want to know how they can challenge it or how they can appeal it. Okay. I should say as well, everyone will be emailed this presentation, so there's no need to take many notes or anything. Okay, so just in terms of the background, the department that's responsible is the Department of Social Protection, and they administer welfare payments. Most people with disabilities would be getting sort of day-to-day support from their families and possibly also disability service providers, and in Ireland that means usually voluntary organisations, non-profit organisations that are sort of independent but they're funded by the health service. So that's the kind of organisations that give support to people with disabilities on a daily basis. So you might be getting a disability allowance or a welfare payment, but that's not going to cover sort of all of your basic needs, so your other basic needs would be addressed mostly by informal family support or formal support from a service provider. And I just wanted to say as well that entitlements to any of this is not guaranteed. So even if you meet the criteria, there's no absolute guarantee. It's not like you have a right to a particular payment. You must apply and you have to go through the process. If you feel that the process is a bit unfair in some way, you can appeal. But it's not a binding legal right. So sometimes people come in and talk about, you know, my right, I have a right to this, I know I have it. So you just have to be a bit careful in terms of what you tell people so that they don't get raised expectations, just something that's not a legal entitlement. So I'll start with one of the most obvious ones, which is the disability allowance. And this is a social welfare payment that's means tested. It's available to anyone with a physical, sensory, intellectual disability or mental health problem. In order to get disability allowance, you can claim it once you're 16 and you can no longer claim it once you become 66. Then you just have to be assessed for old age pension and you don't get a separate disability allowance anymore. You have to have the condition, whatever it is. It has to be expected to continue for at least 1 year. You have to have a medical form signed by your general practitioner.
Just a moment.
Yeah.
You said the 16, right?
Age 16, yeah.
Now what about the below?
below 16 there are a range of other payments mostly provided to carers and parents. So there's one, for example, called the domiciliary care allowance that's provided to full-time carers of persons under the age of 16 with a disability. So under 16 you're not entitled to the payment yourself as an individual, it's more a family payment. Makes sense. Okay, so in terms of the means test, it's really quite complicated what is and isn't taken into account, but if you look this up on the Citizens Information website, all of the detail is there, and you can print that out and bring it with you to clinics so that you can explain it to people, or even just direct people to the website itself. The basic rule is that anything you earn over €120 per week is going to be counted as income, and the maximum amount of the payment, it changes, but it's about €188. So that's sort of for people who have like the lowest level of income, and then if you receive income above €120 per week, the rate of your disability allowance will be reduced in accordance with that. Certain assets that you have will not be counted in the means test, so your home is not counted as an asset when they're calculating how much disability allowance you can get. So if you own your own home, you can still get disability allowance, it won't be counted against you. And I think up to €50,000 in sort of savings and investments is discounted from the disability allowance as well. There is a habitual residence condition, which means that people have to prove that they are living in the state legally and that they're entitled to be here, and that they intend to continue living here for some time. This has been particularly a struggle for people from outside the EU to demonstrate that they meet this habitual residence condition in order to benefit from the disability allowance. There are various ways in which you can demonstrate your intent to remain in Ireland. Some of the more bizarre that I've heard is buying a grave plot, because that demonstrates that you intend to remain here for a very long time. But anyway, you don't need to resort to measures as extreme as that, but it's just something that could affect people from a non-EU background, so just to be conscious of that if you're advising someone in the clinic who comes from outside the EU. But that's the case for all social service payments, for all social welfare payments, or almost all of them. Okay, there's a specific separate blind pension that is the same amount as the disability allowance and mostly on the same terms, but has historically has always been a separate payment. In order to qualify, you need to have medical evidence that you are blind or have a serious visual impairment, and there are certain levels that are set in terms of how visually impaired you must be in order to qualify for the blind pension. This payment is only available to people from 18 years and over. So there's a slight discrepancy here between the disability allowance, which you can get at 16, and the blind pension that doesn't kick in until you're 18. It's the same standard means test. Again, if you earn something over €120 per week, more than that will be counted as income. And I should say as well that the €120 is considered to be money that people earn in some sort of rehabilitative employment. So what that means is that traditionally people with disabilities, especially people with intellectual disabilities, wouldn't have worked in the normal workplace. They would have worked in sheltered workshops or other spaces. So that was considered rehabilitative employment rather than normal employment. And so that was allowed, but other types of employment, they're like, well, then you shouldn't be on a social welfare payment if you're actually employed in the open labour market. So that's a bit of a relic from times past. There are still some sheltered workshops in Ireland, but not that many. And there's been controversy about them as well, because a lot of the workers there wouldn't have the same labour rights as others, and they've been excluded from unions some of the time, and there's some other problems with that we don't really need to go into today. But just to be aware that money is generally, that's counted towards the means, is assumed to be coming from some sort of rehabilitative employment rather than open employment in the labour market. But if the person is employed in the normal labour market, as we say, then you could still make an argument that their employment, if it's not exceeding this amount of €120 per week, is sort of some form of rehabilitative work, even if it doesn't appear to be. Okay, so then the other things that accompany the blind pension is that a person usually gets a free travel pass, which again is something that many people on disability allowance can get, which entitles them to travel for free on public transport. Some people, depending on the nature of their disability, may also qualify for a companion pass, which means that they're entitled to have someone like a personal assistant travel for free with them also. and that's also available to people who don't necessarily qualify for social welfare payments but just have a mobility limitation or some other disability. And there's a separate payment called the blind welfare allowance, which is also means tested, and it's much less than the blind pension, but it's an additional payment, again a historical issue that was there, something that was specifically there for blind people. But it is also available, and if you've step one is kind of qualifying for the blind pension. If you have qualified for that, chances are you will also qualify for the blind welfare allowance, but it's means tested, and for that one they'll take into account your income in the blind pension when they're calculating whether you get any of the blind welfare allowance. I realise this is starting to sound quite complicated, but I mean, I suppose the important thing is just to know what different types of payment there are and the general rules. We can't give anyone a guarantee that they're definitely entitled to it. They will have to go to Citizens Information, they'll have to go to their local social welfare office. So we're just giving them the basic information that they need to figure out if they need to take that next step. We're not expected to be experts on it.
Can I ask a question? When you mentioned the mean test is calculate the individual income or the whole family income?
Yeah, it depends. If you are claiming for a dependent, then so if you're claiming on your own behalf, they will assess your income. But if you are also claiming for dependents, other family members, they will assess the means of the family as a whole. So it depends on whether it's one individual applying or an individual plus other dependent members of their family, usually children or spouses. So it depends on the person applying, but it can be the means of the whole family.
Because in China, in Chinese context, the mean test, the minimum living standard is the whole family. Whether you want to independent or not, it doesn't matter. Because in Chinese law, we think the people with disability, they couldn't independent. So when we mean test is the whole family. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's not.
That's the wrong concept, I think.
Yeah, well, I mean, regardless of what the correct approach is, just in terms of what the actual Irish approach is, it is more of an individual means test, but they will take into account family assets if you're claiming for dependents. So that's the best way to advise them.
One more question.
Yeah.
What about the practice within EU countries? For example, if I'm the visually impaired person, I'm German visually impaired person, I'm settling and I'm staying here in Ireland. Do I eligible to claim?
Yeah, the transferability of social service payments is a really tricky issue. It varies from country to country, and it's very difficult for the EU to enforce rules across the EU about the transfer of payments. So individual arrangements have been arrived at where someone who's working in Ireland for a year will continue to claim their German benefits while they are in Ireland. Each country has its own eligibility rules about how long, whether you need to be physically in the country in order to collect your payment or not. So it's really, really complex. It'll very much depend on the person who comes to the clinic, what their situation is and what country they're coming from, and we'd have to research the rules for each country before we could give them a detailed answer, to be honest. But it certainly is a problem. Beyond the general social welfare payments, it's actually quite complicated, especially if people have personal assistance allowances and they try to move those within the EU. I know that I know of several cases where that's been a problem, where people have literally not been able to move country to take up a job because they wouldn't be able to transfer their personal assistance entitlements with them, and they wouldn't qualify under the country that they were to move to, like standards or eligibility for personal assistance. So it's definitely a barrier. It's something we're aware of. We're trying to encourage the EU to do more regulation of that, but right now it's not really happening. So yeah, it's an important point. Okay. Occupational injuries benefits. So now I'm moving on to, those are kind of the examples of the classic means tested social welfare payments, and now I'm moving on to the ones that are more available to people who have at least been in the employment system for some time, rather than the sort of unemployment type payments. Because I should have said at the beginning, disability allowance was originally intended as a compensation payment for people with disabilities, because it was assumed that they would not be employed. So it's based at around the same level and has the same kind of eligibility as unemployment allowances are for people who don't have disabilities. Okay, except that of course people with disabilities tend to stay on these payments for a lot longer.
Do they stack, so the disability payments and the unemployment payments, would you be able to get both of those?
Both at the same time? You could, but if you had already qualified for one, they would limit the amount of the other that they would give you. So they wouldn't allow you to claim the full amount of both payments simultaneously. Yeah.
But why two? I mean, the particular person claim the one, then one should be sufficient, isn't it?
Well, that's the idea, that one, like, you should have sufficient from one payment in order to survive, but that doesn't take into account the additional costs that people with disabilities have. So, for example, people might need more heating in their house or because of their specific disability, or they may have more transport costs because they can't use public transport because it's not accessible. So really the disability allowance is seen as something a bit separate to compensate for the additional costs that people with disabilities will have, rather than just a payment that's given to people who are unemployed. So it's a little bit different, and there are additional costs associated with disability. Okay, so the PRSI payers, so people who have paid into what we usually call their stamps, so they've been in employment. I don't know if anyone uses that anymore.
Yes, I do.
Okay. So this is people who've been employed and then perhaps acquire a disability. There's a specific benefit for occupational injury, so that's for a disability or an injury that's been acquired at work. The first one I'm going to talk about is the injury benefit. So this is where someone acquires an injury, they're unable to work. So you're entitled to, in the immediate aftermath of the injury, you're entitled to 26 weeks, up to 26 weeks of injury benefit, depending on how long you've been paying into the PRSI contributions. After 26 weeks, you'll be taken off injury benefit and you'll have to move on to either you would apply for disability allowance or illness benefit. Okay, so it's a sort of short-term fix for people who acquire an injury. The next payment is disablement benefit. So here, all that's required for injury benefit is that you're unable to work, okay, because of the injury. And again, you'd need medical evidence of that. Disablement benefit is a bit different. You don't actually have to be unable to work, but you've acquired some sort of a disability. The way they describe it is some loss of physical or mental faculty, which again is probably a bit of an outdated definition, but that's the one that's there. So again, that's a sort of a transitionary payment, and then in addition to disablement benefit, you may be entitled to an incapacity supplement. I know all of these terms sound really awful, but essentially that means that after the 26 weeks of disablement benefit, if you're not entitled to go on to illness benefit, which is the next level that you would get after similarly from injury benefit, you might be entitled to an incapacity supplement. So then those two types of payment are based on inability to work. So even though the first one is about you've just acquired some sort of disability, you might not be unable to work, but you might have some additional costs or some other issues, you can get this benefit. If that continues after a certain period of time, you'll have to transition on to either illness benefit or apply for incapacity supplement, okay, to supplement your income. So the last type of those then is called the constant attendance allowance. Okay, so this is where someone has personal care needs due to a disability acquired at work that are quite significant. So they would need maybe 24-hour support or quite intensive care, and that's something that they can apply for if they've already been employed as a benefit, and it's not means tested. Okay, so these ones are all not means tested, they're based on how much you've contributed into PRSI while you've been employed. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to talk a little bit about personal assistance, because I'm not sure if this was covered when you did independent living, but it's something that people associate with independent living. There's different types of personal assistance available to people with disabilities. The confusing part is that there's no one national system of eligibility and application, so it's not like social welfare where you apply to the Department of Social Protection. It's a sort of one-size-fits-all system, and you just either you meet the boxes that need to be ticked or you don't. Personal assistance is localised and region specific throughout the country, so you would be applying to the health service executive for your particular region. So applications go into the disability area manager. So for Galway, I've put the number and the name of the person who is in charge of personal assistance inquiries and applications. There's two ways of doing it. Either you apply directly to the health service, or you can apply individually to specific disability service providers. So most people, if they might be living at home with their family, but they might be getting some support from a disability service provider, so they would apply to that service provider to get personal assistance. The benefits to doing it that way is that the disability service provider manages the whole thing for you, and they send the PA out when you need them, and they set up a rota, and they manage the person's employment contract. You don't have to worry about any of these things. That makes it quite easy. But some people don't like the different systems that have been set up by service providers. They feel they don't have enough choice. They want to be able to hire their own personal assistants. They don't want to have to go through a disability service provider who could take a cut of the funding available. So then people have the option to apply directly to the health service for that funding and to manage it themselves. But the downsides of that, of course, are that you are then responsible for hiring someone, for making sure that you become an employer, and you have to make sure that people are liable for their own tax, and there's quite a lot, I suppose, involved in that. So mostly I think people still tend to go through individual service providers unless they're people that are really confident and able to step into that role of being someone's employer, or their families are willing to do that. The main service providers in Galway that would deal with personal assistance that I'm familiar with are, for example, the Centre for Independent Living and the Irish Wheelchair Association. It is quite difficult for people who have intellectual disabilities as opposed to physical disabilities to get personal assistance. It's kind of clear if you have a physical disability, okay, you need a PA to help you get out of bed into the morning, get into your chair, get to work, get to wherever you're going. When you're talking about someone with an intellectual disability, it's harder to identify what exactly the things that a personal assistant would be required to support them with. So even though technically there's no reason why they're certainly not excluded from applying for personal assistance, in my experience, people have less success applying for personal assistance when they have an intellectual disability, because it's harder for them to prove what they need a personal assistant for, unless they have an intellectual and a physical disability, which of course does happen as well. Okay, questions about personal assistance?
Yes, here, this disability area manager, is this the representative of the
Health
government?
service, yeah. The state agency that manages the health service, yeah. That's what
I have a
that.
question. This personal assistant for everyone with disability, intellectual, psychiatric,
Yes.
blind, deaf.
Everything. In theory, everything, but in reality, it's mostly useful for people with physical disabilities. Yeah.
And you also mentioned the people with physical disability, they can hire their PA.
Yeah.
It means they will pay for the PA directly.
Yes, that means if they get funding directly themselves from the health service, they can use that, they can manage that funding themselves. But that's quite a big task for people, if you're not used to managing a budget and being an employer, it's quite a task to take on. But it's possible. Not everyone has that, but some people have direct funding from the health service, and they hire and fire their own PAs.
So how much do a PA can get? For example?
Yeah, you're assessed based on your needs, and then you'll be allocated a certain number of personal assistance hours based on the activities that you say you need help with, which again you need medical evidence for. So PAs are paid, I think, relatively well. I'm not sure, they're certainly paid above minimum wage. So I think it's more linked to health service staff pay scales, so like nursing pay scales and things like that. Even though a lot of the time PAs would not be people who have like a medical or a nursing background. So, but they're linked to those kinds of pay scales. As far as I know, I'd have to double check that. But yeah, it's certainly above minimum wage. Okay, any other questions about personal assistance? Okay, so yes.
All people with disability, there is diversity or some severe disability, that's okay. All people with disability, they are willing to get the benefit from the government, or some they don't want.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on what benefit you're talking about. If you're talking about disability allowance, people see that as something that's primarily designed for people who are not working. So people with disabilities who are working would not be interested, would not want to identify, would not want to go for a disability allowance because A, they probably wouldn't qualify because they're earning too much. So certainly there's lots of people with physical disabilities in particular who are not getting any kind of social service payment. Probably the numbers of people with intellectual disability on disability allowance and other types of social service payments are higher. And then it's a real mix in terms of like other types of like mental health issues, whether people are on disability allowance or not, or whether it's even because it's less obvious whether somebody they don't have a visible disability, as we say. So it's it's harder to tell whether how many people are on disability allowance for that reason. So I think definitely with everything there's a certain amount of stigma attached to social welfare payments, and people don't necessarily want to rely on them if they can avoid it. But since the economic crisis, less and less people can avoid it. So there are, of course, quite high numbers of people claiming these payments.
Yes. In order to receive the disability allowance, is there any kinds of verification or as categorization of the personal disabilities? What
Yes.
types of people can receive actually the allowance? Otherwise, because there are different kinds of disabilities.
Okay.
But what sort of disabilities people with disabilities can receive the allowance?
So it's just medical evidence that's required, and all you have to demonstrate, there's a whole range, a whole really long list of things, conditions, medical conditions that are considered to be disabilities for the purpose of the payment. All you have to demonstrate is that it impacts on you in some way, and that it's serious enough that it's likely to continue for more than 1 year. You can be reviewed, so even if you initially qualify for a disability allowance, you can be reviewed in a year or 2 years to determine if you still have, especially in terms of mental health, if your disability is still significant enough that you should be qualifying for disability allowance. But in theory, quite a long list of conditions, some serious, some not so serious, would enable people to apply.
Yes, but in Nepal there are, it is categorized in 7 types, but the people who they receive the card it's that it is categorized in 4 types, the cards which they receive from the government, as blue, red, yellow and white. And the people who we have the red and blue is they are considered as to be receiving the allowance, and the people who has yellow and white, they
Okay.
are not supposed to receive the allowance.
Okay, so yeah, we don't distinguish in that way. I know that other countries have systems where you can get like, you have to be 50% disabled to get this level of allowance. We don't have that. You may be getting some funding from a disability allowance, but the amount of that funding will depend on a number of factors, including your means and including the disability. But we don't have distinct categories that you've mentioned there. Yeah.
If
Okay.
a person is disabled and he is eligible to get some kind of funding from the government, and you have the 2 categories, and so if one category is not enough, then we can go for another one.
Okay.
It's also reasonable.
Yeah. Okay, so just move on to assisted living, and this is again, it's not a state payment as such, but these are the kinds of services that are offered at a regional and local level by disability service providers. So I've just listed this one here, which is provided by the Irish Wheelchair Association. So this is a payment or a fund that's available to people who need support with personal care, things like washing or dressing, domestic care, cooking or feeding, social support, overnight or weekend care, and assistance in accessing employment or education. So this is sort of a beyond just kind of straightforward personal assistance, and it extends to like accessing employment and education, so it's a bit broader. Again, there's 2 different options here, either the self-directed, like I mentioned with personal assistance, where you're in charge, you get the money, it's up to you, you hire the person, you're responsible. Or there's the supported package, so this is where the service provider, in this case the Irish Wheelchair Association, they will do all of the employment related stuff for you, but then they will also take a percentage of the fund in order to administer it. And I've just included again the contact details at a Galway level if people are interested in trying to access that assisted living fund. So there's a phone number and an email address there that people can contact if they are interested in that. Okay, so then at an even more local level, looking at the university, so what are the supports that are offered here? There is a disability support officer within the university, and students with disabilities can register with the disability support service. Again, there's an evidence of disability form, which is quite straightforward, and it's only available to full-time students, so that's an issue that's come up in the past where people are part-time or doing sort of courses by night in university, they might not be able to access this kind of support. So it's support with the university experience. So again, looking at mostly academic support, so where if people need additional classes, personal tutorials, or some sort of grinds. If they have special exam requirements, if they, most people will be familiar with this, they need extra time, or they want to take it in a different setting or a different room from other people, and getting access to materials in alternative formats, so electronic formats or other formats that people are looking for. So just sometimes it sounds really obvious, but sometimes people just don't know that that office is there and that that's a support that they can access. I think people have concerns about confidentiality as well, and they may not want their other classmates to know that they're getting like additional support. They don't necessarily want to identify as someone who gets additional support. So it's just that people have the confidence to know that that system is, their confidentiality can be preserved in that to a certain extent, and that people will only know about the supports they're getting where they need to know about it. So that's sometimes an issue for people.
I had a student ask me there during the week about a PA for while they went to college here. And initially the disability officer had funding for X amount of hours. Now they've withdrawn that.
Okay.
Yeah, and that particular student, is the problem here with the disability office, or is it the social welfare?
Yeah, so there's
Is there a bit of a-
there's two different systems. The HSE are responsible for personal assistance outside of the education context. When it's the education context, it's the Higher Education Authority that provide a grant to students in full-time education. And that's administered through the university, but it's the Higher Education Authority is the overall body responsible. So it's HSE for health and other stuff, and for education it's Higher Education Authority. They have their own eligibility systems and ways of allocating whether or not people are eligible. Generally the only requirements are that they are in full-time education. I know that before they used to have a cap, you didn't get any additional support past master's level, because I don't think they thought that people with disabilities did PhDs, but that's been changed now. But again, it would be an issue with the Higher Education Authority's funds rather than maybe at the university specific level.
So this particular student, even though she plans to appeal the decision, is she appealing to the right body?
Yeah, it's important to check that.
Where it's student support services.
Right, well you can check within the university first, like, what level of control does the university have over the funds that are allocated, and is there any way in which you could argue that they, didn't do what they were supposed to do in terms of allocating the funds? Was it within their discretion, or was it just something that was handed down by the Higher Education Authority and they had to abide by it? So it's worth just asking that question through the disability office and figuring that out. And then if they have the discretion, pursue internal complaints procedures. If they don't have the discretion, you need to be writing to the Higher Education Authority and pursuing an appeal within that
Yeah, and she gets a carers allowance aside the university.
as well. That's separate.
Yeah, that's
okay.
separate. And what's happened is that she provided the disability office with all her requirements.
Okay.
She's on crutches, and she just had she's mental and physical impairment. And initially they assigned an assistant to her for quite I think it was 70% of her time here at university, and now they've withdrawn it to, I think it's only 3 or 6 hours a week.
Okay.
She needs a PA to obviously to take notes and to do that. It's that type of thing. Now she's going to student union about it.
Okay. There's no harm in going through. You can pursue a number of complaints mechanisms at any one time, but it's just important to figure out whether that was a decision at the university's discretion or was it something that was handed down by the Higher Education Authority.
Yeah.
So that you know which one to pursue. Yeah.
And would the disability office take into account if she was getting social welfare and she was getting carers allowance for outside the university?
It's not really their issue.
It's not their issue.
They shouldn't. It shouldn't impact on what's provided within the university.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It's separate.
I think she'll probably come here.
Yeah. Well, that's great. Yeah.
Because that's what I said.
Do encourage her to come.
I said to her that we'll be leading to the information.
Exactly.
And to come and speak to somebody.
Yeah. That's great.
Out to Disability Service Center, I don't know, they have lift or not.
Good question. I haven't been over there, so I'm not sure. But I'm pretty sure they do, because I know that our former coordinator with the clinic uses a wheelchair, and the student who used to run the clinic with us and she goes over there all the time, so it must be physically accessible.
It's still not the
Yeah,
best
yeah.
option.
Okay, so that's the Disability Office. I just want to bring people's attention as well to the National Advocacy Service, and this is a service that we would refer people to a lot from the clinic. So it's a state provided service, but it's independent of the HSE. It's not connected to any health services or to any disability service providers, and in fact it's linked to the Citizens Information Service and funded by the Department of Social Protection, but they've managed to stay quite independent of them, which is really good. The idea is that it's the people who are eligible to acquire a personal advocate under this National Advocacy Service are people with disabilities who can't access their entitlements because of their disability. In theory, it's open to both children and adults. I think that most of their work has actually been with adults rather than with children, because there's a number of reasons for that, but a lot of the time, you know, the strongest advocates for children would be their family members, and so they wouldn't be kind of going through the National Advocacy Service, whereas when you come to situations about adults with disabilities, sometimes they're in conflict with their family members, so that's why they would look for the support of a National Advocacy Service. So the advocate is an independent person, an independent professional whose role is to support the person with a disability to exercise their rights, and advocates operate from a very sort of human rights-based perspective. They're not about best interests, they're not about telling the person what to do or what's best for them. Their job is to be loyal to the person and support them and be on their side. To be honest, because the advocacy service is spread out across the country. There are 5 regional centres, and I have the contact detail for the person who's in charge of the Western region, but that stretches all the way from Donegal down to Clare. So they have to cover that whole region, and they don't have that many staff. So primarily the kind of stuff they get involved in is really sort of crisis situations or really serious situations. So we can certainly tell people who are not in crisis to contact them, but chances are they won't get an immediate response. But where people are in a really difficult situation, like they're having difficulty where they live, or they want to move out but they're being resisted, or there's some sort of serious concern about their rights, that's the kind of cases that the National Advocacy Service would get involved in. So we do signpost people to that a lot, and you might look for an advocate for things as simple as trying to appeal your social service payment if you felt you were denied a social welfare payment that you should have been entitled to. It's quite a hard thing to go through the appeals process within the system, and you might look for an advocate for that. And I know that some people have had advocates from the National Advocacy Service help them with that kind of stuff, but most of the time, like I said, it's more focused on the serious situations and the crisis, and trying to resolve those than dealing with the more everyday stuff. But I think that the Citizens Information Services have actually stepped up their game a lot. A lot of their premises weren't initially physically accessible even, but I think they've made improvements in that in a lot of places, and certainly in the Galway office. And so yeah, there are options for people there. They have learned a lot about how to communicate with people with disabilities, so that those places are accessible to people and that they can get the information they need there without having to go through a specialised service. So that's kind of important as well.
Can I?
Yeah.
What's the difference this one with the legal aid services?
Oh right, they're not lawyers, the national advocates. There are, some of them might have a legal background, some of them might have a social welfare background, or social worker background maybe, or some of them might have worked in disability services. They're not lawyers, and they're just sort of an independent person who's there to support the person with the disability. They do end up in court quite a lot with people, supporting people through court cases, but they're not legal professionals.
It's like activist.
Yeah, some of them come from an activist background. Yeah, there are some people, like I can think of one advocate in Dublin who's really strong, who came from a background working in gay and lesbian equality. So she came from that perspective to work in disability, and she was just a grassroots activist campaigner, not connected to disability initially, but then worked more and more in disability, and is now a member of the National Advocacy Service. The other thing is that one of the criticisms people potentially make of this service is that it's more for people with physical and intellectual disabilities and people with mental health issues sometimes, even though again technically they are entitled to this service, they tend not to access it as much, or the work that the national advocates do is less focused on mental health issues, it's more focused on physical and intellectual disability. Having said that, there are specific mental health advocacy networks as well. So there's the Irish Advocacy Network, which is peers, a peer network, so people themselves who have mental health issues who support others and advocate for them. So that's an example of one. And there are other examples of specific mental health networks if people are interested in that kind of advocacy. So there's been a little bit of a split between this kind of work and the work in the mental health field, which is a shame because it's all good work, it's all connected. But sometimes people feel more comfortable with a specific mental health service if that's what they're looking for.
Could you elaborate a little bit this? What is the interpretations, the facilities for the people with hearing impairment or something like that?
Oh yeah, I think people with physical and sensory disabilities, including like vision impairments and hearing impairments, can certainly access the National Advocacy Service, but the idea is that it's someone who, because of their disability, can't enforce their rights. So usually that's not such an issue for people who are blind or deaf. They know what their rights are and they're telling people what they are, but they may not be respected, which is a separate issue, I think. So it might be easier for them to just go and get straightforward legal representation and challenge that in court, perhaps than it would be for people with intellectual disabilities or other kind of complex combination of physical and intellectual or perhaps mental health issues. So that's
sign language interpreter.
Oh, rights to sign language interpreters, yeah, I mean that's always a contentious one because under the Equal Status Act, which I think you learned about a bit already, sign language would be considered a service under the Equal Status Act, so it's something that can be provided for someone as a reasonable accommodation, but our standard for services is quite low, so that you don't have to provide a reasonable accommodation if it exceeds a nominal cost. The expenses associated with sign language are significant. It will always be more than a nominal cost. So if you show up to the doctors and you don't bring your own interpreter, they're going to say, well, sorry, can you write things down, or can we communicate in some other way because we can't afford to provide you with a sign language interpreter. So that's been a big issue, because Irish Sign Language is not recognised as an official language of the state. We have two official languages, Irish and English, and Irish Sign Language is not one of those. So because of that, many deaf advocates would argue that it's not given the same priority, and so you're more likely to be entitled to an interpreter in Irish than you are to an interpreter in Irish Sign Language. The numbers of people who would speak or use those languages might be very different, but that's currently the case. There's been a lot of arguing for recognising Irish Sign Language as an official language of the state, but as of yet it hasn't happened. So that's where sign language stands. It's a good question. But actually, in terms of the clinic as well, that was something we were worried about. Would people not be able to access the clinic if we didn't have sign language? So we've asked for people from the deaf community who use sign language, if they need to contact us, to let us know plenty of time in advance so that we can try to arrange for an interpreter. And the centre here would pay the cost of the interpreter if somebody needed an interpreter to come to the clinic. So far it hasn't been an issue. We haven't had someone come who's needed an interpreter, but we are thinking about that, and for a while we were wondering, should we also provide a text number for people to text the clinic, because deaf people might use text rather than using email, but then we thought if we have a text number it would get really complicated, and if we had a mobile phone with the clinic we could get all sorts of crank calls. So far we haven't provided a text number, but it's something that we've thought about doing, and so far we've hoped that people can access us through the email address rather than if they can't call us up. Text number, yeah. Okay, so just finally I'll just talk about appeals and complaints. So the social welfare appeals process, I'll cover a little. Then there's also internal complaints process within disability service providers. The health service has its own complaints process, and then if all else fails, there's the ombudsman. So the Social Welfare Appeals Office, you have to, if you've been refused social welfare payment, you must complain within writing within 21 days of being refused. This goes back then to the Department of Social Protection to review your case. You can maybe add new evidence, so if you have additional medical evidence that you didn't have at the time you made your application, you can add that to your appeal. They might hold an informal oral hearing. You don't need to bring legal representation with you to the oral hearing, but it's allowed if you do want to do it. But you might bring, for example, an advocate rather than a legal representative, and that's fine. In general, after they've held that hearing, the decision of the appeals officer is final, but there are some very small exceptions which you can read more about on the Citizens Information website. It's very, very difficult to appeal the decision of appeals officers. It's interesting though, if you look at how many social welfare claims were initially refused and then granted on appeal, quite a high number of the ones that were appealed are actually granted. So there are questions about, like, are people being refused in the first instance in the hope that they won't appeal it and try to enforce it? But yeah, my experience is definitely that a lot of the time, if you do appeal, you have quite a high chance of success. So that's important for people to know, and that it's not such a formal like court hearing or anything like that, so that people shouldn't feel too intimidated about going through it. Okay, then individual service providers. So I've given an example here of a service provider in Galway, the Brothers of Charity, who provide services mostly to adults and children with intellectual disabilities. So here, it varies depending on who is actually providing the service to you and what their internal process is. But most disability service providers have some sort of internal way of complaining if you're not happy with the service you're receiving. Even if they don't, we can advise people to complain in writing, like identify someone who is high up within the organisation and write to them, put your complaint in writing. You know, don't leave it too long between the incident happening and the time that you write a formal complaint. And then some service providers have these things they call human rights review committees, and those are there for people within the service who feel like their rights are being violated in some way, and the purpose of those committees is to hear those complaints. And the good thing about those committees is that they usually have people with disabilities on them, so that they have like the experience of people with disabilities, and they usually have external people from outside the service. So for example, I sit on the one for the Brothers of Charity. So, you know, I don't have any vested interest in like trying to protect the service, so when people come forward with questions about their rights being violated, there's independent people who can assess that issue. Like, it's not the same as like a formal legal complaint or anything, but it's just a bit easier usually for people to go through those local channels, rather than, you know, most people don't have the time, the energy or the resources to take a legal case. So you should make them aware of whatever opportunities they have within the service or at local level.
Yeah. Can
Yeah.
I ask?
Sure.
This is internal control,
Yes.
internal quality control. What's the difference with the board? Because normally the NGO have a board, with a volunteer, board members. What's the difference? The human rights committee.
I suppose these human rights committees that I'm talking about, they meet regularly. They meet every month, and you know, anyone can bring an issue to them from within the service. And their only purpose of meeting is to consider human rights issues, whereas the board is considering all sorts of issues about funding and resources and other things. So they have other things to consider, whereas we in the Human Rights Committee then only have to worry about, are the human rights of the person being respected? If not, how could we change things to make sure they're being better protected? So that's slightly different focus.
Yeah, but some board member can sit in this committee.
As well.
Yeah, in theory, yeah. Although actually, I'm thinking of the one that I sit on. I don't think there is a board member on it. Yeah, because they would be at a much higher level, I suppose, within the organisation. So the committee that I sit on has like a parent representative, with 2 self-advocates with disabilities, myself and another person who's independent from the service, and then maybe a social worker from the service or 1 or 2 others within the service.
Volunteers group.
But your decision should be delivered to the board member if it's a
We
real
do
violence.
report. Oh yeah, okay. So we do report then to the board on the decisions that we've made. But like, those aren't legally binding decisions anyway. We're just making recommendations about, okay, well, if this person is being restricted because they're not being allowed access to the kitchen in the house that they live in, for example, that's an issue that comes up. Because it's felt that they're not safe in there on their own, or they would maybe damage themselves in some way. This is an issue, it's restricting their freedom. So we would make suggestions about, okay, well, have you tried leaving the kitchen unlocked? Like, is it really an issue? When was the last time there was a problem? Those kinds of things. But those recommendations, are communicated to the board, and we do an annual report of all the cases that we look at. But we have to be careful to keep them anonymous as well. And within a small service, it can be clear who you're talking about when you're considering the individual circumstances of the person. So we try to report on it in a very general way and what the recommendations are at a service level rather than giving out too much information about the individual.
So normally the board will agree your suggestion.
Oh
and will
yeah,
change.
our suggestions are binding without the, like, we don't have to go to the board to get authority for, like, once we've made the decision and written to the relevant people, then that's it, that's what has to be followed. So that's the board has agreed that our process will be there and it must be followed.
You got that mandate.
Yeah, exactly, that's the
board.
mandate we have, yeah.
Because in our contact we have no such
Yeah.
such committee to make the internal complaint.
Well,
Yeah.
lots of services don't have that kind of committee, but it's become more popular in recent years. It's become kind of a way to show that you are serious about people's human rights, so
Yeah.
more services have tried it. The other complaints process I just want to briefly mention is the health services. They have a complaints process called Your Service, Your Say. So if you're getting a service directly from the health service executive, so that could be anything from like a stay in hospital to public health nurse or any type of health service really. You can complain, and I've just put up the link there to the online form that you can download and send in your complaint on. Generally they try to resolve the complaints locally. If that doesn't work out, then it will be reviewed by a complaints officer within 30 days of the complaint. If you're not happy with what the complaints officer says, you can appeal it to the Director of Advocacy within the health services, and they can review it, and ultimately, I mean, they make the final decision from the health service side. If you are unhappy with that, your final point of appeal is the Ombudsman. As it is for every public service with which you have a complaint, you try to pursue the complaint within that public service, and if all else fails at the end of that process, you can approach the Ombudsman. Actually, and I've heard good things about the HSE, Your Service, Your Say complaints process. I think maybe not that many people use it, so when you do use it, you have some likelihood of it being taken seriously. So then the Ombudsman is the final one I just want to cover. It's complaints about all public bodies, so whether that's like local government, government department, a state agency, the health service, an education service provided and funded by the state. Those are all things that you can go to the Ombudsman about. You must go within 12 months of the incident occurring, and you must also have made an attempt to resolve it first within that body. So lots of complaints to the Ombudsman are deemed inadmissible because the person hasn't tried to resolve the complaint within that organisation first. It's important for people to know that if they want to complain to the Ombudsman, there is a link service at local level, so that you can, via your local Citizens Information Centre, you can discuss how you would create a complaint to the Ombudsman. They can help you with your complaint. So again, I've put the address of the Galway Citizens Information Centre that can help you with that, formulating your complaint to the Ombudsman. And generally those complaints to the Ombudsman are handled informally, but sometimes the Ombudsman will undertake an investigation if it's a particularly serious issue, and come up with recommendations. Our most recent Ombudsman has been really strong, very outspoken, Emily O'Reilly. She's now just left the post to take up the post of EU Ombudsman, which will be interesting. She'll definitely be missed in Ireland. And she actually was quite understanding about disability issues. In a lot of her annual reports, she mentioned the fact that she was concerned that people with disabilities weren't complaining to her, and she said, I know this is not because they don't have complaints, it's because they don't know that I'm here or that I can deal with their complaints. So she's been quite strong on disability issues, and hopefully her successor will be strong on that as well. But it's just important that people know not to go to the Ombudsman straight away, because I would get a lot of people like calling me with various complaints, and like one of the first things they say is, I can complain to the Ombudsman, right? And you're like, well, what steps have you taken to resolve it within the organisation? So it's just to make sure people have done those preliminary steps so that they don't get their complaint deemed inadmissible by the Ombudsman. And I think that's it, yeah. So I just have some links there at the end of the PowerPoint, which everyone will get in an email. So the most important resource for you is really to look at Citizens Information website. They also have a publication specifically on the entitlements of people with disabilities. The rates of payment in it are out of date, but it's a really good guide. It has like case studies of like, I have a relative with this issue, what payments are they entitled to? So it's kind of a good way to learn the different issues. And yeah, just check the organisation's website then for the rates of payment. But again, like I said, we're not a social welfare centre, so what we're doing is really signposting people so that they know they can apply for these benefits and telling them how to do it. We're not telling them that they will get it or, you know, that they must apply in this way. But we can also offer for people, if they are complaining or appealing something, we'll read letters. We can't write them for people or on behalf of people, but if they come in to us with a letter, we can read it and we can give them advice about how to write it even stronger. So those are the kinds of things we'd be involved with in social welfare care. Anyone have any final questions? Yeah.
Sorry.
Has everyone signed the sign-in sheet as well? Can I just
Yeah.
make sure? Okay.
How many kind of ombudsman in your system, in your country system? Sorry, I don't
Just
know.
one really, and there's also the Children's Ombudsman, but that's has quite a limited role. It's more about policy, whereas the overall Ombudsman has a remit for all public bodies.
Okay, so
But yeah,
two. Yeah.
two, I guess, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm asking so many questions.
Okay.
I'm really already asked. Still, I'm wondering with one thing. Okay, for example, I'm a disabled person other than EU countries, and then I'm staying here Galway legally.
Mm-hmm.
Then I feel my human rights are violated or denial somewhere. For instance, the house owner is denying giving me the house.
Okay.
In rent because of my disability or something like that.
Yeah.
So they come and
Yeah, so it depends on the issue. If it's a housing issue, you go through the appropriate channels. So you would complain to the Residential Tenancies Board and Private Residential Tenancies Board. You should be using those mechanisms. If you find those inaccessible to you, then you can make a complaint about that eventually to the Ombudsman if you wish. But you should use there are complaints mechanisms available there for all the different types of rights violations. So whether it's employment, whether you go through the Employment Appeals Tribunal, whether it's housing, you go through the Residential Tenancies Tribunal. So you should be using those tribunals rather. There's no one specific place that people with disabilities can go to have all of their human rights protected. It depends on the type of human right that's being violated.
maybe that might be the longer process for me. But if I come there, then it can be connected.
Well, yeah. If someone approaches us, then we can signpost them to the relevant organisation and help them through that process if they find it difficult.